I'm working for Eurospace, which is the main trade association for the European space manufacturing industry. So we do a lot of market monitoring. We also do a number of economic surveys, which enable us to keep track of the financial and economic health of the European space sector. Launch policy cannot be understood if it is not serving an application need. So there is a lot of excitation around launch. I don't understand the enthusiasm of private equity and venture capital in funding launcher development. Launch service is a bit of a different thing because you buy launch, with one single exception, you only buy launch because you buy a satellite before and you need to launch it. So launch demand is a consequence of satellite demand.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Hey, space enthusiasts, welcome back to another episode. And today my guest is Pierre Lionnet, and he's the Director of Research at Eurospace. Welcome, Pierre.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to this Space Business podcast.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to have you here, Pierre. I'm following you a lot on social media, and I appreciate the openness of your opinions, your views on the space sector, and I thought you'd make a terrific guest, so I'm really looking forward to this episode. But why don't we start off a little bit, just like 1 or 2 minutes, just introducing what do you do in your day-to-day job?
Yes, thank you very much. So, I'm working for Eurospace, which is the main trade association for the European space manufacturing industry mostly. So we are a small business. We're about 8 people working here, and we work for our members. So we are paid for by the companies, and we try to produce a number of useful activities for them. My line of business within Eurospace, beyond being manager of this small team, is mostly related to research activities. So we do a lot of market monitoring. We also do a number of economic surveys, which enable us to keep track of the financial and economic health of the European space sector at large, and also to help them understanding what is the market environment. And so we do a lot of market studies ourselves for our members exclusively. So we have data capabilities embedded in the association. And we also do a lot of, let's say, benchmarking or commenting on existing market studies and publications. And some of that eventually surfaces into social media, where I may have sometimes blunt takes on what other people do. And this probably also brought me a specific following, but also a number of opinions, and sometimes felt as a contrarian, meaning that I'm not always following the big crowd and the big opinions which are surfacing around. And I'm always open to discussion, of course. So I'm very happy to be here with you. So that's my job, putting together market studies, market opinions, and trying to direct our industry into the right market decisions whenever we can.
So this would presuppose the existence of quality data, right? If you want to take good decisions and produce good analysis, good data has to be available. So space is very much, of course, you and I, we're in the space sector, so we're probably biased, but it is a small niche sector, different from many other sectors. Is there something that, I guess the question is, how different or hard is it to do this job in space, in the space sector?
Well, first, I must say that I never did this job outside space, so it's difficult to compare. On the other hand, when I have a lot of contacts with people in which are doing strategic studies, market studies. Also, I have friends and colleagues which are working in other areas. I come from a financial background, and most of my old university friends are working in banking and private finance. So usually, I'm also sharing a number of views with them. I think that space has one major advantage, is that space activity is still quite small. I mean, it's been growing, with lots of more satellites being launched, lots of mass. But I remember 10 years ago, you could really intimately know each launch event one by one, because there would be 60 to 80 launches a year, and a total of 100 or 120 satellites would be launched. That means that as an analyst, your core data set, which is space activity measured by what goes to orbit, sometimes what comes down to Earth, it was very easy to embrace. Today, with the growth, it's a bit more difficult, but we are still working with an environment which is, again, in terms of measurable output from an economist perspective, it's still quite small. overall, I believe that the space industry worldwide remains a niche industry. I think that maybe 800 to 900,000 people in total are actually associated to this very specific business, which consists in building launchers, building satellites, and operating them. So it's a very small environment. Again, if you compare with other, figures that you have in mind, the auto industry in Europe is supposedly employing about 3 million people. So you see, just in Europe, just the automotive industry is much bigger than the space industry worldwide. On the other hand, there is one major difficulty in space, is that a lot of the activity in space remains managed by countries which are not so open to us in the Western world in terms of information sharing. If you consider Russia or China, clearly it's very difficult to get, anything in terms of information. And then there is the defense dimension. A lot of the activity which is associated to the space business is associated to defense programs. And in that domain, it's very difficult to get information, even if, it's technical, financial, etc. So that's the difficult part.
Yeah, and actually, if you phrase it like that, let me ask you a provocative question, because what I mean, the way you phrased it now, you look at output, number of launches, maybe number of satellites, all of this, and that sometimes it's hard to get information. I mean, my provocative question would be, how different is it being a space sector analyst outside of China from being just a SpaceX analyst?
Oh, well, SpaceX becomes now, one of the massive contributors to our databases in terms of number of lines. We have 1 line per satellite. So of course, now most of the lines we have are Starlink satellites and Starship satellites. So there's a lot. On the other hand, SpaceX makes it somewhat easier because things are very much standardized. So every Starlink satellite looks like the previous one. Again, version 1, version 1.5, version 2. I don't want to get into those kind of details. So clearly, yes, a lot is happening around SpaceX. On the other hand, from the economic point of view, while SpaceX is really changing a lot of things in terms of volume of activity, you cannot accept any other assumption than the fact that those SpaceX satellites and those SpaceX-related launches, the ones to deploy the Starlink satellites, are very cheap to build. And so overall, while SpaceX is changing a lot of the dynamics in the space industry in terms of innovating with volume production, volume launch, things that nobody ever did before, on the other hand, if you look at the total amount of budget, of money, which is available to deploy those spacecraft, it is rather small. One piece of information that we've been sharing recently with our SpaceX webinar, we assume today that the full deployment of the Starlink constellation so far, so all those almost 8,000 satellites that were launched in total for the constellation and the launch activity associated to that, would have cost in terms of CapEx to SpaceX between 10 and maybe $13 billion. So that's over 4 years now. You see 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, even 5 years. And so that's about, let's say, 2.5 billion a year. That's the contribution, the economic contribution of SpaceX to funding infrastructure deployment in recent years on an average yearly basis. You put that against the other figure that we produce at Eurospace, which is about $60 billion, which is the cost of deploying all the other satellites worldwide. So you see 2.5 against 60. So this means that while SpaceX represents massive volumes deployed in orbit, due to the fact that by construction, this constellation must be incredibly cheap to produce, incredibly cheap to launch, the overall impact in the total space infrastructure economics remains limited. To put it the other way around, it means that in the end, building SpaceX satellite, if it was an activity to be managed by a company like Airbus or Boeing, would probably drive them revenues even lower than what they are today if they could match this kind of cost structure for those deployments.
Yes. But I mean, that's a tricky subject, right? Because I mean, if I wanted to, I understand what you're saying, but if I wanted to twist that a little bit, right? I mean, that one could think that almost implies like, oh my God, if we want to sort of maximize the economic output, let's make sure we continue using the SLS.
Not necessarily. Yes, I see your point. Again, it's a very good point. Again, the industry I work for, you see the people which are paying the membership fees to Eurospace, which eventually pay my salaries and the rest of the team, their concern is what kind of market opportunity do I have? who is buying what types of satellites. And today, again, if we want to make, super simple, basic rule of thumb comparison, I could say that today SpaceX is building Tatas, very cheap mass production cars, while our industry is still in the business of producing high-end Mercedes and Rolls Royces for a different set of customers. And the point today is, for these type of companies, should I remain in this business, building, high-end luxury cars, which, have a niche demand, which produces a lot of turnover for every customer, or should I transition towards offering a cheaper production car that would eventually create maybe more profit thanks to higher volume of production? So my take on this is that there's no clear cut. I don't think that you can build James Webb Telescope, admittedly one of the most expensive spacecraft launched in recent years, with Starlink mass production solutions. So there is a balance to be found. On the other hand, there is one thing which I'm pretty sure about. It is that if today the trend is towards cost reduction, standardization of satellites, and rather than selling 1, 2, 3 units, like we see, with programs like Satcom BV or the Copernicus Sentinels, there is small series effects because you only produce 2 or 3 similar units of the same spacecraft. And at the other end of the spectrum, you're building 5, 6, 10,000 satellites, almost all identical. And then, of course, each satellite eventually has a very small marginal cost. But then the profit you make on each satellite may be very small. So there's probably something happening in the middle. And when you look at what is happening with the Space Development Agency, they're now ordering relatively small but biggish batches of satellites, almost all identical. And then you look at the price point they have of those, it's much more expensive, all things equal, than a Starlink, but it's much less expensive than a Satcom BV. So probably the industry, is facing those moving points. And that means that they need to change also the industrial structures which they're using to build those satellites. I remember a few years ago, there was a big transition that was made when the Globalstar constellation was built in Rome, and I was lucky enough to visit the assembly factory for those Globalstar satellites. And it was very interesting because I visited that at the end of the production. And the person that was, touring us around the factory, he was telling us that it was incredible because they could cut down a lot of operations on building those satellites, which enabled them to drive down the cost of the last production units quite a lot. But what was interesting, it was that the production setup was different. Typically, you put one big satellite in the center of the white room, and then you have all those technicians and engineers. They come, it's like a totem, and everybody's coming to worship the totem at their own time, adding a piece, making a test, etc. With Globalstar, they started production this with small, flexible, ELO, we say it in France. So it was a very different way. The satellite was moving around the different operations. And when something was going faster, you could accelerate the rate. Nobody was idle waiting for the satellite to come. So this was a way to modularize the production, and it could be done because it was a series of 100. In this case, I think that this is something that may become more popular, more useful, and may eventually improve a little bit the productivity of the overall sector. But I'm still not sure that this will improve the profits.
Yes, we don't know yet. So I think, oh my God, there's so much to unpack here. We could probably talk for hours. But so I'm starting from the back. I think your production analogy is a very good one, right? So I mean, at some point in time, you quoted Tata and the automotive sector, right? And it's true, like in the automotive sector, at one extreme, you go to the Bugatti factory in Alsace, and there you have the Bugatti in the middle, and people come and add parts, basically.
Exactly.
And then you have the Tesla Model 3 assembly lane, right? And of course, I don't think we have anything close to a Tesla Model 3 assembly lane in space yet. I mean, probably the Starlink assembly line is the closest thing. But I mean, the heart of what it gets at, so I think there's a natural sort of market segmentation that's going on, right? And probably the space sector for decades has been stuck in this sort of like lower volume, higher value production paradigm, right? And we're now only scratching the surface on, I wouldn't even call it mass manufacturing, maybe very few companies, SpaceX leading, like volume manufacturing, right? And the question now is, if I used another analogy, let's say of computing hardware, right? And so roughly speaking, before the 1970s, right? Very low volumes, mostly bought by governments, basically, right? Computers, filling a room, probably, I don't know, I'm guessing they took a long time to build and were very
Oh, I
inefficient.
believe so, yes.
And then in the 1970s, some people basically started taking a bet saying like, well, why don't we produce higher volume numbers of like slightly less powerful computers and see what happens, right? I mean, I'm simplifying, right? And it feels to me a little bit like we're at a similar moment in the space sector, right? That I agree with you. We don't actually know whether this is going to be all profitable, how many profitable business models there are. But I mean, there's only one way to find out, right?
Yes and no. The point is that with the analogy with computers, eventually you move something which was a very unique kind of system that could only be afforded by some very specific users that had specific needs associated to that, towards, the common PC that now we even have in our pockets with our phones. With space, it's a bit of a different thing because not every application requires thousands of satellites that would eventually enable to generate, those low unit costs, even if in the end, the total volume of investment remains quite important. I'm taking an example here. If you look at the Galileo constellation, is perfectly dimensioned today in MEO with 30 satellites. And so the overall cost is still quite a lot. The overall cost of Galileo from the top of my mind would be around maybe 4.2 billion. You see, for building 30 satellites. So you probably could scale it down and do this type of service. And I know that there's a lot of R&D already going on from LEO. That would require producing more satellites. Would that be more efficient in the end? I'm not sure. You see, because those satellites in LEO, eventually, instead of building 30, you would need probably 200, 250, maybe even 1,000. And then the replenish rate would be more frequent. And in the end, if you look on a long-term basis, full life cycle cost of your system, and you look at all the different impacts, would that be a better service than what we have in MEO? Not sure. And eventually, is the economics much better? Again, not sure. I'm not saying it's necessarily clear cut between one and the other, but sometimes you don't need that many.
But I think, okay, so again, I'm going to be provocative, right? Like leaving aside all the political aspects of Galileo being a European system, right? Couldn't one at the extreme think about like, I mean, this is clearly not politically palatable, but to say like, oh, the current way of like building Galileo is way too expensive. It's ridiculous. It's costing all of these billions of dollars. We'll just give the contract to SpaceX. Don't you think because of the effect of cross-subsidy and the marginal cost for them is so low that it would be significantly cheaper?
Well, you are assuming that SpaceX can build all the technologies which are required for Galileo, which I think is not the case.
Not all of them, but maybe
the clocks and everything. So again, the point today is that we can assume that SpaceX today could actually sell to anybody who wanted one something very similar to a Starlink satellite at a very low marginal cost. This is the assumptions that everybody would be making. I think that this assumption is not completely true. First, because we know that SpaceX is not pricing the things at cost, but it is always, taking a good margin, and they're right to do so. That's
why would they?
Of course, but then again, the assumption that because it would be SpaceX, it would be less expensive is not an assumption which makes sense, because SpaceX is only cheap for SpaceX. You see, if you look at the assumptions we are making today with the Starship program, much similar to the ones made by the guys at Payload and Quilty, by the way, we all believe that those satellites are not very cheap to build. And this is because eventually it's a 1.8 billion award. If you look at the type of bid that SpaceX made for the SDA PWSA, it's exactly on a par as the ones made by Lockheed and Millennium Space, etc. So there is no differentiator. Probably SpaceX is making better margins than anyone else, which is an assumption which I'm ready to take every day now at this point. I think that they have created for a lot of their offering a situation where they can rake in a lot of gross profit on every single sale. On the other hand, to go back to your initial question, assuming that SpaceX could do anything, I think it's a bit of a stretch, because when you start looking with detail, as we have done in the past, I've been managing for Eurospace the innovation committee for years, and we were producing the strategic research and innovation agenda for the space sector in Europe. And we were looking at those cutting edge technologies, which are a requirement if you look at the demand set of a space agency like ESA. If you look at the expectations of a military agency in Europe or in France like the DGA, clearly this goes a bit beyond all the very basic technology requirements, which are the solution for SpaceX to be cheap. Take the example of the solar panels. Everybody was very surprised to learn that SpaceX was putting silicon solar cells onto their Starlinks. I don't think you can actually have anybody in CNES, DGA, or ESA accept that for an expensive program where you put a lot of investment in the payload. Look at the Gaia program. Look at the CSO program. The payload is inherently expensive because it is a complex payload, either for a science mission, either for a tactical intelligence mission. In those cases, you may want to extend the lifetime of the satellite for many good reasons. And then the requirements are stepped up. So you could build a satellite, but then it's not exactly the same design. You deviate from the cheap design to go to something more expensive, and then maybe SpaceX cannot reapply those mass production solutions that drive the Starlink cost so low. Clearly, you see, it's, again, you say, okay, let's go and buy a Tata instead of buying a Rolls-Royce. But then, I would like to have a turbocharger on it. And then maybe I would like to have bigger space in the back. And maybe I need to have, reinforcement and airbags everywhere. And then maybe also leather seats, and then heating on each seat, and then whatever. So you start adding requirements, and eventually you're back to the Bentley or the Rolls-Royce, even if you're speaking with Tata. And at that moment in time, you must ask yourself, was Tata the best provider to actually match all those requirements? I'm not sure. I'm not saying they couldn't, but then you are opening a different business unit with them.
I think it should be neither Bugatti nor Tata. I think there's space somewhere in the middle, right? People who build a high quality required product, but with customization.
But also, I would like also to insist on the fact that the core demand today is coming from all those institutional programs. If you take the example of Copernicus today in Europe, Copernicus, we are ordering satellites in batches. So the last invitation to tender was for 12 satellites at once. And the total money on the table was 2.5 billion euro to procure just the manufacturing and R&D for those 12 satellites, all built in pairs, 2 by 2, with 6 different missions. So you could ask yourself, if the expectation is to collect this data set, which is then used, for climate monitoring, vegetation cover, etc., it's very much a scientific demand more than anything else. It's not something for the insurance world. You say, okay, I have 2.5 billion. Maybe I could, instead of buying 12 satellites, I could buy, let's say, 100. So the mission would be a bit different, but then you would be spreading out the cost of the payload over many more satellites. And your payload would not be as good as it would be as you have for only 12. And then you would also save a lot on the platform. But then the scientific outturn of that mission, would it be better? You would have more revisit, so you would have fresher information, but I don't know if this is a mandatory requirement for the Copernicus mission. And in the end, you may have less accurate measurements from each satellite because of the scaling down of the payload. For instance, when it's optical, the size of the satellite matters. When it's a radar, the size of the satellite matters. So you see, all those trade-offs are not that obvious. And again, when you're looking at a commercial business case, the question is very different because you are looking at a very specific set of requirements. You can get to the meat and bones of that requirements. You look at what AST Space Mobile is doing, what Link is envisaging today, speaking with SES, trying to improve their design by having, links to GEO, etc. So here you're really looking at scaling it down, how to make it work within a business case. And so you cut corners everywhere. And this is what Starlink has achieved probably like no one else ever did before. And I think like no one else will be doing in the future. I think that they've reached a point today that they are very difficult to displace. But for everything which is institutional, it's a bit different than that.
I think that's true for Starlink, and I mean, I'm biased as a shareholder, but also for SpaceX at large, right? Because this integrated flywheel of creating the low marginal cost per launch by effectively producing high cadence through internal demand it was just a genius move that hasn't been matched by anyone else in the world. I mean, it's clear that Rocket Lab wants to try to go the same direction, but they're obviously like probably a few orders of magnitude away from that for the moment, which kind of brings up the question. I mean, if you agree to this point that this was an amazing flywheel, so to say, combining volume manufacturing with internally produced cadence, and then of course the reusability, which is useless without cadence. How is anyone going to touch them? I mean, so sometimes people kind of, as you know, I'm a VC investor, right? I mean, you don't know, maybe you do know how many times I get comments from startups or even from fellow investors like, oh, this is the next SpaceX, or this is the European SpaceX. I mean,
No.
do you believe
No,
that?
I think I would like to take, so I think you made a good point. So, but I would like to take a contrarian view again.
Yeah.
Let's put it the other way around. Assume that you start a very solid and well thought out launch business. And what you're thinking about is making more launch. And your business is launching stuff in space and eventually building a good system that generates profit for you. And then progressively you can lower a little bit your margin because you could sell more. And you lower your price, lower margins, then you grow your demand. But at some point in time, you see that the demand is not coming, because Falcon 9 has exactly done this. Clearly, as soon as Falcon 9 was available for commercial launches, you could see them undercut the competition systematically on every bid.
But
and so they were
they
raking
don't.
in customers. But, moving the price just so that, it would maximize the profit on each launch while making sure that they would gate the contract for them. But at some point in time, I believe that people in SpaceX has been thinking about elasticity. So should we change our pricing policy in order to grow the demand base? And then eventually you have more volume of launch, lower profit on each launch, but globally more profit overall. And I have the impression that they came up with the strange conclusion that lowering the price would not grow the demand. Otherwise, they would have done it. And they would have let, other constellations access low launch cost with a profit for SpaceX without going into the difficulty and CapEx effort of actually deploying their own constellation. I'm wondering sometimes, and I've read all the books about Elon Musk, so I know that he was thinking very soon, at least this is reported very well by Ashley Vance and also by Eric Berger. And very soon he came up with the idea of this Starlink constellation in order to enable to grow the cadence. But that was because nobody else was coming up with this idea. One of the reasons behind that is because SpaceX has never signaled the fact that they could produce at a lower price for the customers. So there is some kind of a, strange, because you call this as a flywheel and it's presented as, a genius idea, which it looks like in retrospect. But if your business is building launchers and providing a launch service, it's a bit of a disappointment to see that everything you look internally at demand elasticity leads you to the only, let's say, sad conclusion that in order to improve your economics in launch by volume, you can only create your own demand. If you look at the other way around, you can say, well, I'm McDonald's, nobody's buying my burgers, so
no,
I'm
sorry,
eating them.
Pierre,
I'm exaggerating a bit, but
the explanation is pretty simple. Satellite communications, and this, is a far bigger business than the launch business, right?
No, it's not. It is, but only marginally.
On pure numbers. I mean, how big is the total launch business? How big is the satellite? And even if you had some elasticity, right?
No, I don't think this is true in any possible way. Again, moving the business of commercial communications from GEO to LEO has created more demand for launch, but it has not really significantly increased the business of satellite communications. You see, I think there is a very strange take on that. Communications business is something which may be about $1,000 billion for all the services, and then maybe $1,000 billion for all the infrastructure. Space infrastructure is only a small size, a very small share of the total. And services delivered by satellites, they may represent today, let's say, I don't know, with the geohistoric business, maybe there's still 10 billion left in revenue every year. On top of that, you have maybe 6, 7, 8 billion with Starlink. That's 18 billion out of 1,000. It is very small. Again, the only very big difference, and it was a smart move from the SpaceX perspective, is to move it down from GEO to LEO, where you basically have to deploy much more mass for the same gigabit offering that you can sell, which creates more business for launch. But then you see again, if you look at it from a contrarian way, which is one I'm taking on purpose, to stimulate the discussion,
Sure.
because it's not completely that way that it happened. But you say, okay, nobody's buying my Falcon 9, even if it's slightly cheaper than what we used to do before, because nobody needs more launch, because the commercial business in GEO only needs about 10, 15 launches to GEO every year, which is not enough for me to, produce more and create more revenue and eventually build more profit on Falcon. So I will go down and attack this market directly from LEO, because I make the bet that integrating everything, satellite production, launch service, and offering all the way to the customer the service myself, including building the terminal, I will be able to optimize everything and to win this bet that everybody lost before me. And again, I must say that I was surprised. And if you follow my Twitter account, at the beginning, I couldn't believe it. And now I believe that there is indeed a number of economic fundamentals in the SpaceX Starlink approach that makes it a potentially revenue-making business case. But Elon Musk himself said it many times, my first goal is not go bankrupt. And I still believe that this is a difficult goal, because in the long term, I believe there will be difficulties because the RPU is going down. The cost of deploying is still high because Starship is not available yet. So you see the fundamentals are still fragile. But in the end, even if SpaceX with Starlink manages to make $30 billion in revenue a year, it will still be just a small fraction of the total telecoms business, because by construction, space communications cannot become a mass market application for every single communication need that we have.
No, that's fair. And I didn't mean to imply that. What I would imply is that compared to launch, and I think, you have actually, because I know you're doing this analysis, you have more up-to-date numbers, or estimates, I should say, than me, right?
Everybody has estimates, right?
I think the Starlink revenue is, what is it now, 8-9 billion, and the launch
including the
is,
terminal sales. Yes, that's more or less.
Yeah.
Yes.
And the launch is what, 4 or 5? So already Starlink is much bigger.
In my analysis, so I have, like many other analysts, I'm making a lot of assumptions, and differently than others, the work I do with assumptions is not very much to try and identify what's real. It's more to try and eliminate what's not realistic at all. But at this point in time, I came to a few conclusions on SpaceX on my side, is that one of the very new things about Starlink in terms of the economics of providing a commercial satellite communication service from orbit is that, differently than everything else done before, launch, even as cheap as it is today, remains and has become the main point in CapEx. And I believe that the constellation now, the production value of the satellites is really very low. And on the other hand, I believe that due to the expandable upper stage and the uncompressible launch operations, today there is an asymptote which has been reached in terms of full launch cost for Starlink satellites. And with this asymptote, everything that he gains in terms of economies of scale on the manufacturing of the satellites doesn't have an equivalent in launch service. And in my guess today, if you look at the total Starlink CapEx, I think that launch is between 60 and 70% of the total, which is huge. Again, if you look at the business model of the GEO satellite operators, launch was about 10 to 20% of the CapEx. So this is inverted. And again, this is interesting because if you start thinking in that way, you see that Starship becomes essential.
It's critical.
It's completely critical. Because it removes the expandable upper stage, and we know it's a difficult thing to achieve, but then indeed, it opens the way to more economies of scale in launch, and then to better economic fundamentals for this offering from LEO, and then again, creating the opportunity to grow the offer in terms of capacity without impacting too much on CapEx, and then addressing the question that new customers will pay less and less for the same service. Because, of course, this is the functioning of every market. It's an S-curve. So it's interesting to see.
Yeah. And so there's a couple of following questions here. One, so if you stay on launch costs for a moment, because it's interesting. You have, to your credit, talked about this a lot, that this sometimes very broad stereotype that, oh my God, launch costs have come down so much is not that's not exactly like that. I mean, if you look at the rideshare costs, they've actually increased, which brings us to a question. What do you think it takes for actually, because right now, honestly, including for me as a space investor, right, it looks like sometimes if I exaggerate it, it looks like most of a good part of the money that, you know, fund like mine or colleagues' funds give to space companies actually ends up at SpaceX, in the same way that a lot of the money that's being invested by VCs in AI companies, it just ends up at NVIDIA. And so
Yes,
are we going to move away? What will it take for launch costs, the cost decreases actually to be passed on? Is it like competition? Is it that Starlink will be very mature, Starship is operating, they're fine, they're like, okay, we got enough capacity, it doesn't matter anymore? Or what do you think it may take?
honestly, I don't know, because as you noticed, today, SpaceX is now the leader in commercial launch. So everybody with a launch need and which is ready to buy from SpaceX will go to SpaceX. And I have the impression, also shared by private conversations I've had with friends in Arianespace, that it's very difficult to bid against SpaceX for many reasons. You know, they have a kind of number of contractual clauses also, which are guaranteeing good prices, all considered, for the customers, and then limit also the potential for those customers to go and look elsewhere. But to go exactly to your question, today there is the cost of producing the launch service, which is clearly very different now if you look at SpaceX and then ULA and Arianespace, for all the reasons that we know, including the partial reusability, but not only. And then there is the price offering. And today, what is interesting is that SpaceX is indeed providing what the whole community at large admits is the best price you can get. But we all know that this price is still quite high. I published a small analysis paper on LinkedIn showing that for external customers, the arrival of Falcon 9 didn't change dramatically the pricing landscape. It only improved the accessibility. So you have more launch opportunity. So it's easier to launch since Falcon 9 than it was before Falcon 9, because you have a faster launch rate. You can launch easier, but the price you pay remains high. As I put in my paper, if you're a big customer, you can pay as low as 10K per kilo in LEO. And if you're an occasional customer, the price will be around 20K. And then there are a lot of factors will apply, but this is the rule of thumb. So if now you assume that the trend at SpaceX is to enable actual launch costs, which are below 2K per kilo, you see that there's a lot of margin. If the price offering was around that price, there would be many other business cases that would be enabled. The problem is, what would be the inciting point? How could you stimulate SpaceX to lower the prices? I think that there's no way, since now they're also playing the game of offering satellite services. And so with this low cost, they have a unique trump card that nobody has, which means that people who start thinking about integrating and replicating the model, if they can eventually drive down the cost as much as SpaceX has for launch and satellite production, then they may be competing with SpaceX, Starlink, to put it bluntly, on an equal footing. But everybody is at least 5 to 6 years late. So people coming into the market will always find the well-seasoned Starlink market segment, market share, experience with launch, experience with operations as a major showstopper. I think that it will be very difficult. And again, I don't see what could be any stimulus for SpaceX to drive down the price, even if they accede to lower launch costs. Starship may be a difference, because if Starship needs to be as efficient as Falcon 9, and you know, all things equal, even if things are quite different between the two, my guess would be that it would need to launch as much as Falcon 9. So let's assume now 100 tons of payload in LEO with Starship. And let's assume cadence like Falcon 9. That would mean, let's say, 100 launches a year. Starlink would only need maybe 50, 60 of those. Artemis would need maybe 20. That leaves maybe 30, 40 launches for external customers, which is 40,000 tons, if my calculations are right, which is a lot.
So how does that compare, for example, just to give our listeners a view, roughly to the total up mass, say?
That would be almost
lot,
20
right?
times more. Yes,
exactly.
20 to 30 times more. So that means that you would be able with Starship to deploy everything that Starlink needs, plus everything that Artemis needs, plus already 2-3 Starlink constellations on top of that every single year in terms of launch capacity. So who would be putting the payloads on those Starships and at what price? If Starship eventually is sold at $500 a kilo, that means that there's no profit for SpaceX on those launches, but then the cadence enables them to drive down the cost, which makes Starlink profitable. You see, that's the idea. But then you would need to have 2-3 business cases, the same size as Starlink, using this capacity every year. And this is where my mind doesn't make it. I cannot conceive that you could, deploy so much at mass with sufficient, business cases to actually make it profitable, even if the launch price is small, because there you still have to pay the satellites and then the gateways, and then you need to find a business model for that. And I don't see what business model could that be.
Yeah. Okay. So, but okay, again, sort of like to be not provocative or like contrarian, but I'm not saying that I fully believe this yet or it's correct, but kind of you're an economist, like Say's law. So kind of the supply creates the demand. It's sort of like if I take another comparison again, right? I mean, I'm old enough to kind of remember when mobile phones first started. And people kind of like, nobody needs this bandwidth. Then we got to this bandwidth. Now it's like, nobody needs the next bandwidth jump. Then we got to that bandwidth. Now it's like, oh, nobody needs that bandwidth jump. And here we are with TikTok and everything. It just gets filled with something that people come up with, creative people, more creative than me, entrepreneurs. So I don't know, maybe there's some big use case that we don't envision yet. Or on the other hand, I also think there may be some concrete examples, right? So if you stay with SpaceX and US launch demand, I mean, you mentioned the SDA and you said it was relatively small. I think compared to Europe, it's actually probably not that small.
Yes, relatively small compared to Starlink.
Compared to Starlink, exactly. But we wish we had it in Europe, maybe. And then there's like, okay, this is a whole, we could talk an hour about that. There's the Golden Dome on the horizon, right? And how many platforms that may need and who's going to launch that. And so I see some potential avenues.
I think so. Golden Dome is a completely different story. I think this will go. I don't believe in that. But to go to your first point, build it and they will come. That's something we hear a lot in the Silicon Valley and everywhere else. And it's a credo. It works for some products. You're producing a juice machine and people buy it because they like juice and, whatever. Launch service is a bit of a different thing because you buy launch. With one single exception, you only buy launch because you buy a satellite before and you need to launch it. So launch demand is a consequence of satellite demand. And satellite demand is the consequence of a business case where you would offer a satellite-based service. So all things equal, if your satellite is cheap and your launch is cheap, your business model is easier and may generate, like Starlink has proven, more deployments in orbit. On the other hand, if you don't have a satellite need, you don't have a launch need. So this is why I'm putting the things the other way around. And I say, who could be the customers and what kind of killer application would come after Starlink that would provide this additional demand that would fill up, the Starship cadence?
Yeah, so I totally agree with you. And it's amazing how few people think like that. But it's, to recap what you were saying, which I totally agree with, you only have launch demand if you need to launch a satellite. But then you have to take the next step. It's like, what do you need a satellite for? Right? Okay, Starlink, communications, right? So, and I feel like people are not attacking it enough from that front, right? Even if you look at sort of industrial policy, so maybe if you switch over to like industrial policy, national space policies, right? We're both European. We could talk about Europe if you want. It feels like in many places in the world, they're trying to they're hell-bent on pushing out like a national launcher industry. And then everything else seems like an afterthought, like who's going to use these launchers?
I agree with you. I've been very vocal about this. Sometimes I don't understand the launcher development policy. And I must say that I don't understand the enthusiasm of private equity and venture capital in funding launcher development too. So there is a lot of excitation around launch. I think there's some hubris behind that. I think there's also the fact that I have seen quite a few launches, including a space shuttle launch. And it's, it's a very physical moment, if you so there is a lot of, again, I think sensitivity around this launch thing. On the other hand, in Europe, as much as in the USA, I fail to understand the launch policies that go beyond the autonomy point of view. And, in Europe, we have Ariane and Vega. I don't think we need to support so many other emerging launch systems. I think that consolidating the Ariane and Vega supply chain is already very costly. And sometimes people ask, I think rightfully enough, why does it cost so much? I don't think that anybody can understand exactly why this is costing so much. But I agree with you. Launch policy per se cannot be understood if it is not serving an application need. And in Europe, I think that, again, with the new space narrative, with the excitation around the small launch and medium launch and new launches and reusable launch, everybody's focusing on that, losing a little bit grasp of the fact that if you don't have a consistent satellite program, whatever that is, for defense, for civil observation, for meteorology, for whatever you want, you don't need launch at all.
Exactly.
This,
so
this is something which is quite disconnected today.
Exactly. I fully agree. And so I sometimes say, and we just mentioned these programs, right? So in the US, I mean, if I really simplify it, right, you could say like that whole thing in the US is basically driven partly by Starlink and then partly by the DoD via SDA and maybe the Golden Dome in the future. I mean, is there an equivalent in other parts of the world? I also don't want to pick only on Europe, but
China, yes, China has many equivalents. Yeah. I mean, China, of course, is today the big challenger. And in some areas, they may even be leading, which is something that people are not ready to accept today. But I think that looking at the array of launchers, for instance, which are developed and operational in China, it's the largest array of operational launchers worldwide. They have every technology, from solid to liquid. They use hypergolic launch. I mean, they really check all the marks. And the only thing they're missing so far is partial reusability. But putting China aside, indeed, nobody today can match the Chinese or the US needs for launch. And still, I think you're perfectly right with your observation. Everybody seems to be focused on developing new launchers. And there is today to be more sensible into the preparation of consistent industrial policy to develop programs that Europeans need, that the Russians would need. Again, this is very much national and sovereign policies that we're talking about, but there is more interest in launch today in Europe. Also, we could see that in India, for instance, and even in South Korea and in Japan. I mean, this is happening everywhere, and people are maybe losing ground with the question of what for? What are we launching? And the European Launcher Challenge, which is issued recently, includes, a set of reference launch missions. A number of missions listed there don't even exist. I mean, Europe is not buying those missions. I don't even know where they are in the reference list. I don't want to go and point the finger because then, people will get angry at me. But clearly there is some kind of misconception there. So we are creating this launcher challenge, but we don't know exactly what we will be putting on those launchers. So I think you're perfectly right. And sometimes I wonder if there shouldn't be more investment into actually making programs. And then, the people who do good launchers with a good technology and an accessible price, then there will be the winning entities of this new emerging growing launch market. Otherwise, we see that the launch demand remains more or less flat in value, slightly growing in volume. I'm putting Starlink on the side, of course, because Starlink is exploding all the statistics. So it's another thing. But clearly, we see that launch demand is not growing. And when I look at the way the VC and private equity crowd is investing in all those new companies, I see that very little money, and I would say an insufficient amount of money, is going to people who are potentially buying satellites and launches. So we have an overwhelming amount which is invested in developing new launches, and an insufficient amount which is put in companies like, I don't know, Capella and Umbra and Link and ASD Space Mobile, so that they eventually have the money to buy the satellites that would create this additional launch demand in a solvent way. And again, that would be a transformational thing, because if more VC money went there, then there would be much more opportunity to launch, and the launch business case would become less tense. More launchers would come on the market, and competition would eventually kick in for prices to drive down.
So once more, I think we end up agreeing a lot, actually, probably on most things. So I agree with you here too. I mean, it feels like, well, both from a industrial policy point of view, but well, you tell me whether you agree or not, as well as from an investor point of view, simplistically speaking, more money should flow towards final customer applications
Yeah.
that then require space upstream hardware. And it seems
I
right
think
now we're
that-
just doing it the other way around.
Yes, I think that this could be a game changer. And indeed, the key point is, what is the application?
Yes.
And what is the money which is available to fund this application? If the application is a public service, then the point is, what is the cost of the infrastructure? And is there enough to fund it? But if the application is a commercial one, is what you can take out of the money of your customers, whether they are companies, whether they are private individuals, to fund your infrastructure. And then you scale it down to what would be the minimum launch price for this business case to become profitable.
Yeah.
And here I have a few points I would like to share. I think that if you start looking at launch prices today with 10 to 20K dollar per kilo to launch, you can only materialize profit with long duration applications where basically it's the geo solution. So the launch cost is so expensive that your satellite lifetime must be very long in order to amortize also the launch cost. And if launch cost goes down to, let's say, maybe 1.5, $1,000 per kilo, which is more or less what Starlink has achieved today, this is opening a number of potential business cases like, data centers in orbit, even if I don't think this would be very sensible to do, but this is opening new gates. And if you go down below $500 per kilo, then maybe you start opening a niche market for tourism and other more complex solutions like solar power satellites and these kind of things. But you see, it's still a long way to go because I'm talking about price here. So the price paid in your business case.
But so again, from a both industrial point of view as well as actually from a company point of view, so you have this potential, how can I say, bottleneck or catch-22, right? That maybe you can even have high conviction it makes sense if launch prices at this level, but you're just not willing to take the risk on betting that the prices will come down like in a reasonable time frame, and then you never start the business, right? And of course, then there's various solutions to that, and I'd kind of like to hear your view on whether you think one or the other solution is preferable. So if I can think of possible solutions, one is that you do what some launch companies, again with SpaceX being the prime example, have done, is you just vertically integrate. Now, Rocket Lab is clearly talking about constellations, right? And they bought Mynaric and everything, right? Other launch companies before them, I mean, Astra, before it went belly up, talked about having its own constellation, right? I mean, so the vertical integration is clearly one idea. And I guess the other option would be government subsidies, if governments believe that there is really a market to unlock and it just needs somehow a kickstart. I don't know. If you were, so this is Pierre, I'm going to ask you a really unfair question. If you were tomorrow in the seat of the DG, the ESA DG, or the EU commissioner, and you're tasked with really coming up with a better way, if we believe there's a better way of space industrial policy, like what are some things we should be doing?
Well, I don't think I can talk from the perspective of ESA because I don't want to get into those details, but when you are in the ESA DG, you're an executive, you're just doing what the member states collectively are asking you to do.
Fair enough. Yes.
Which means sometimes doing things which are not compatible one with the other, but you still do them. So eventually, the picture you give of your policy and the way you implement it can be perfectly aligned with the member states' expectations, but then it looks blurry to the external eye. So again, it's a very difficult job to be the ESA DG. And working at ESA, generally speaking, is not easy because of the tensions with the member states, which have sometimes policies which are not aligned one with the other. But to go to the question, is it sensible to unlock low launch cost with subsidies? Well, probably yes, because we did it. I mean, that was the model for the past 40 years. And Arianespace benefited indirectly from the subsidies of ESA because the development cost of all those Ariane systems was fully paid by European taxpayers. And in the United States, it was the same until the advent of Falcon 9, which admittedly received much less R&D support than Ariane 5, for instance, if you want to make a comparison. But I don't think that the subsidy that governments put into the launch system is there to unlock the commercial business. They put a subsidy because they want a reliable launch system for their own needs. And they think that it can hardly be achieved without a subsidy, or that it's better achieved with a subsidy, whatever the point of view. But the subsidy is there because they want guaranteed access to space. And for no other reason. I don't think when you start building a policy and say, okay, now it's also a subsidy and then it unlocks commercial markets, this is what Jean-Jacques Dordain was saying almost 20 years ago. He was saying the commercial market is subsidizing the Ariane system. That was true because the commercial market enabled Ariane 5 to move from a cadence of 3 per year to maybe 7 to 8, which enable to drive down a little bit the fixed cost per launch. So eventually, every customer would get a better deal from the Ariane launch system. But there was a misconception behind the sentence, because without the 4.5 billion invested in R&D by European member states to produce the first launch of Ariane 5, all this would not exist. So you see, that's a very difficult point. But again, I don't think that the subsidy is there to unlock the commercial market. This is, I would say, a secondary benefit.
The subsidy was one example. So briefly, and let's also leave aside Europe. I don't want to pick on any specific region. Let's say you were tasked suddenly to advise a up-and-coming country with resources that wants to develop a space economy. What would be your 1 or 2 or 3 main policy suggestions?
I think you should go where most of the market is, which is in the ground segment. This is also something which is incredibly overlooked. When I'm talking of the ground segment, when you look at those figures, which I don't like a lot, and people know that, but the space economy overall, but the big lumps of money there are with the GNSS chipsets. So the GNSS chipset and the GNSS terminals alone, usually they represent, today, you're going to look at the latest figures published by Bryce, for instance, they represent 25% of the total value of the space economy. So whether you think or not that this value is correct, I think it's overestimated, but that's not really my point. It means that this is where big money is, much bigger than building satellites. Clearly, today, closing a business case, making launch service or building satellites is incredibly complex. Because for launch, if you drive down your cost, you must produce high volume and then forfeit all your profit to the customer. This is what you would do if you wanted to enter that market and displace SpaceX. And SpaceX themselves, if they charge Falcon 9 launch costs only without making a profit on those costs to enable the Starlink constellation to be profitable, that means that they are erasing all profits on Falcon 9. So you see, this is clearly a difficult business case. This is why I would say, if you're into a government and you are looking at investing in space, the key question is, how do I make a business that makes sense for my own public needs? And in this case, and I would like to take an example with what we see from emerging nations, which buy things, they buy their first satellites. So it's Kenya and South Africa and all the. I think that this is a bit distressing, because everybody's buying into a capacity which is either undersized. One satellite for Earth observation doesn't give you a lot today, either oversized. One full constellation for Germany. You see, so for me, the key point here is that, and this is the sentence that I use a lot, the point with space is that space systems and applications usually provide local solutions to global problems, meaning that whatever you do, your deployment solves the global problem. And you take the example of Starlink. If everybody was using Starlink, the overall cost of the constellation for all users would be much less, and the overall load of use on the constellation would be much better. So for me, that's the key problem, is that clearly space applications, particularly in LEO, are global by design. Meaning that if you really want to invest in that, find enough partners so that your global solution makes sense, because if you want to solve a local problem, the cost would always be comparatively very high. And one of the reasons America and China are really investing a lot in those is because they are global players, by all means, strategically, commercially, and diplomatically. But Japan or Korea or Singapore, when I hear that Singapore or Taiwan plan to deploy a LEO constellation, I think this is crazy, because their need is actually very small, and it seems that they have overlooked the problem. And the problem today with space, and I can be very much an optimistic person here, but I would like to see everybody joining forces so that space becomes a collective need and a collective solution without conflict and everything. That would be the best possible world. If you think about it, one GNSS constellation would be enough for 8 billion human beings. We don't need GPS, Galileo, Beidou, QZ, Globe.
But then we get into the sovereignty,
that's the sovereignty
the
and strategic approach. And so you see, you link back to the original thing. But again, the problem here is always the same. When you talk about LEO and MEO solutions, they provide global access, global applications. That means that if your problem or if your market is local, you are probably looking at a, you know, an overkill solution based on your needs.
No, it's a very good mental framework. We could talk for hours. We're sort of coming towards the close here over time. Let me ask you two more questions. So
you should be careful because I can speak 30 minutes on two questions. So I know.
No.
So
the first one, like with everything we've discussed so far, and we touched upon many different points, sort of like current past structure of the space economy, how it's developed, 10, 15 years out, if you had to guess at the future structure, let's say 10 years out, if you had to guess at the future structure of the space economy, what's your best guess?
I have two, let's say I have two scenarios, because I think there is a scenario of growth. Let's assume that SpaceX gets it their own way. They can still deploy. 15 years from now, we would have 2 or 3 competing mega constellations. One would be Starlink or whatever follow-up. I think that Kuiper will be belly up. I don't think that Kuiper can compete. But I think that the Chinese can, because they're not addressing the same geographies and the same markets. And the Chinese have 2 constellations because they have a sovereign one and a market one. So I think there would be 3. There would be a bit too many satellites in orbit, because now we would have reached, you know, what people believe could be a high congestion phase. And so there would be growing concerns with congestion in LEO and growing concerns with environmental impact of launch activity, especially if we launch those very big launches full of methane. And I'm not even considering the hypergolic launches of the Chinese, which are really very strong in pollution. So that would be one scenario, which I believe is a scenario of commercial growth. And this would also support a lot of growth for sovereign systems, especially from the US, but a bit also from Europe, especially if European governments start to work together more. I think that this would create a very complex situation, because commercial systems would be overwhelming, and sovereign systems, you know, defense applications and intelligence application, would have difficulties finding their way. This would create probably a new tension between governments and commercial operators, especially if China is playing also a big role there. So I think that diplomacy around this would be more tense, and there would be more problems. The other scenario would be a scenario where Starlink development slows down. For many possible reasons, customer take-up would not grow as fast as they expect. Then that would create a very serious cash situation for SpaceX. Whatever the situation, if Starlink doesn't keep growing at the rate of 3 to 4 million every year, new customers, then there would be a cash crunch. I'm pretty sure about that, which means that SpaceX would be in a very serious, dire situation, demonstrating that the Starlink business case doesn't work, which would kill Kuiper also, and would kill also the prospects of the Chinese. Then that would change a lot of things. There would also be more environmental concern related to launch. So that would be this scenario where we would discover that this idea of proliferation in LEO only actually makes sense for military and defense users, because they have smaller needs. If you look at the PWSA, if you look at aerospace. And then we would again find this period where commercial space is not that big. It's reducing again, and the space remains an area of dominance, sovereign concerns, military and intelligence applications, with the US and China head-to-head, Russia trying to spike up their game, and Europe hopefully not losing it. And then, you know, this Golden Dome thing, etc., I don't believe it will happen. It will be like the Star Wars with Reagan. I don't make any potential bet for this to happen in any possible way. But that's only my take.
But so your answer was very much focused on, you know, with Starlink and Kuiper and so forth, on satellite communications, and I guess that's reflecting the fact it's the most important part of the space economy right now. Do you see any other, like structurally, like any other applications growing, emerging, worth mentioning?
You know, and this is something I've been speaking quite often about. There is no application other than broadband access, and in a secondary way, the D2D, D2C applications, that requires massive deployments. This is what I was talking about when I was asking, you know, in a kind of rhetoric way, who could actually provide the demand for those additional Starships beyond the need of Starlink? And for me, again, if you eliminate broadband, where basically you need to deploy a lot of capacity because the capacity growth has to match the market demand growth. So more capacity enables you to address more customers. But most of the space applications are non-exclusive consumptions. If you take the example of Earth observation, if you take the example of the GNSS signal, if you take the example of broadcast. So the only other killer app that would require lots of volume would be tourism, but I think we're still very far from that.
Yeah.
Very,
so I think
very far.
we may have to do a follow-up episode where we kind of systematically go through sort of killer apps both in orbit, and then we haven't even talked about the moon and let alone Mars yet, but we definitely have time.
We haven't.
Don't have time for that today. So I do have to ask you the last question, which is, do you like, which is always the same, do you like science fiction? And if yes, what are your favorites?
Yes, I do. But I think science fiction is not a roadmap. I've been reading science fiction since I'm a kid. But now, I'm an old guy. And I realize that what I like about science fiction is how it warns us about a future which is potentially a problem. Among my preferred science fiction books, one is Seven Eves. Another one is the Foundation series by Asimov. But I look at them as trigger warning points, and not, something to follow. And I think that everybody which is a Star Wars fan, and I love the Star Wars aesthetic, I don't call Star Wars science fiction. It's an epic. It's like the Lord of the Rings.
Fantasy.
Exactly. So again, but I really like it. Yes, indeed. And the looks of it, I'm a big science fiction fan.
Great. Pierre, thank you so much. This was amazing. We may have to do like another episode soon because I think I've gone through like a third of the things I wanted to talk to you about. Thank you so much for being here today.
You're welcome. I appreciate you calling me, and that was a very pleasant conversation. So whenever you want, we do it again.
Thanks, Pierre. All the best.
You're welcome.
And that's it for another nominal episode of the Space Business Podcast. And once more, if you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platform, such as Apple or Spotify. You can follow us on Twitter at podcast_space. We're also on LinkedIn under the Space Business Podcast. Lastly, if you have any feedback, including ideas for guests, and that may even include yourself if you have an exciting space story to tell, or interested in becoming a sponsor, or really for any other suggestions, you can drop us an email at spacebusinesspodcast@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening, and see you for the next episode.